I'm David Fisher, and I'd like to welcome you to Model Mania the video. This is the first in a series of tapes designed to inform and inspire you, the modeler, on how to build and paint vinyl and resin kit figures. I'd like to take some of the mystery out of modeling by demonstrating the three basic painting techniques: dry brushing, washes, and airbrushing. Before we begin, let's talk about some of the materials you're going to need, along with how to prepare a kit for painting. Let's take a brief look at the basic materials needed for modeling vinyl and resin figures. One of the first decisions you'll have to make is what kind of paint you want to use. Acrylic paints are the standard for figure modeling due to their wide variety of colors, ease in mixing, durability, and fast drying time. You can use any number of brands of pre-mixed bottled acrylics such as Tamiya or Poly-S, or you can use artist tubed acrylics such as Liquitex. You thin acrylic paints by using water or an alcohol-based airbrush thinner such as Poly-S, or a combination of the two. You will need an assortment of brushes for painting. I recommend spending a little more for quality artist brushes. Pick up a couple of fine tip brushes for detailing. I use a number 1, a 0, and a 00 brush. Anything smaller isn't really necessary if you keep a good point on the brush. You will also need a couple of round tip brushes and a flat tip brush. Modeling pieces are smooth and need to be sprayed with a primer to prepare the surface for painting. I use Flowquill Metal Figure Primer or a Krylon Auto Lacquer Primer. You want to use a lacquer-based primer, not an enamel primer. Enamels will not dry on vinyl. Primers allow the paint to adhere to the surface of the kit. If you don't use a primer, paint may come off on your kit with average handling. The most all-around important tool is a good hobby knife. You use the blade for scraping seams on resin parts and cutting away excess flashing on vinyl. Always use extreme caution with the hobby knives since the edges are razor sharp. You will want an assortment of sanding papers for smoothing parts, seams, and putty work. A small assortment of jeweler's files are handy for getting into hard-to-reach areas. Dental tools are great for reshaping putty and matching textures on your kit. One item I recommend that you look into is a Dremel tool. If you plan on building a lot of resin kits, it will be indispensable. They take a delicate touch, but with practice, can save you a lot of time. You can clean up a kit or reshape parts with ease. To build your kits, you will need a cyanoacrylic superglue. You may want to get an accelerator for speeding up the bonding process. To fill your joint seams, you will need to use modeling putty. Last but not least, one final tool for modeling is the airbrush. You may never choose to use one, but if you do, look into a double action model. Double action means you can control both the paint flow as well as the air pressure. This gives you the ultimate control over the technique. To review your basic materials, you will need acrylic paint, an assortment of brushes, and a lacquer-based primer, a hobby knife, and different grades of sandpaper. You may want an assortment of files and dental tools, a super glue, and modeling putty. For demonstration purposes, I've gathered together several kits that will lend themselves to the different techniques I'll discuss. For this tape, I will be demonstrating different techniques on 4 different kits: the Barker Brothers Lionel from the Human Oddities series, Action Kits Ben Cross Barnabas Collins from Dark Shadows, Atomic Creations Linnea Quigley, and Geometric Designs Pumpkinhead The Metamorphosis. When assembling a vinyl kit, you'll notice that the parts come with excess material called flashing. This will have to be trimmed away using your hobby knife. To make trimming easier, heat the part with a blow dryer or hot water to soften the vinyl. Gently work the blade in a slow, deliberate motion. Always cut in a direction away from your body. If you find yourself forcing the blade, reheat the part. Take it from someone who almost lost a finger. These blades are sharp. For safety concerns, children should never use a hobby knife. After trimming, test fit the parts together before applying glue. Apply a small amount of glue to the surface of a part and press firmly together. You can use an accelerator to speed up the drying time and strengthen the bond. You should use proper ventilation when using glues and accelerators, as the fumes can be very strong. After gluing, you'll want to hide any visible seams using model putty. Apply a small amount with a dental tool or your finger. Work it down into the seam. I use a little fingernail polish remover to smooth the surface. This makes sanding a lot easier. When priming a figure, use a gentle spraying motion. You want to mist the parts with a light coat. It's better to spray a couple of light coats than one heavy one. Let the primer dry thoroughly before painting. I usually let a primed kit sit 24 to 48 hours to allow the primer to cure. When assembling a resin kit, you will notice a seam line that runs along the individual parts. This is normal and comes from the casting process during production. You can eliminate this seam by scraping it away with the back side of the hobby knife. Use gentle strokes. You don't want to create more work for yourself by gouging the surface with the blade. You can also use a Dremel tool for removing seams. The Dremel tool is great for uneven or textured areas of a figure. Once again, a gentle hand is required. Get into a big hurry and a Dremel tool can obliterate important details. After the initial seam work is complete, return with sanding papers to smooth out the areas. With resin kits, it's recommended that you pin parts together for extra strength. A fast way to achieve this is to glue two parts together and drill a small hole through both pieces. Put glue into the hole as well as on the pin made by a coat hanger or a finishing nail. Insert the pin into the two parts, and once they have dried, you can putty over your small hole with epoxy putty. I also use epoxy putty along seams and smooth with water. When building vinyl, remember, soften the parts by heating them with a blow dryer or soaking them in hot water. Test fit your parts before gluing. Use a super glue and putty the seams with a modeling putty. Lightly dust the parts with a lacquer-based primer. When building resin, remember, remove the molding seams with a hobby knife. For best results, pin your joints together. Use a super glue and putty the seams with modeling putty. And be sure to prime your figure before painting with a lacquer-based primer. Before we begin, I need to touch on mixing colors. You can buy most of your paints pre-mixed from the manufacturer, or with a little practice, you can make most of the shades from just a few colors. When painting model figures, you can buy all of your colors pre-mixed, or with a little practice, you can mix your own. This can not only save you money, but allow you to discover colors you could never buy straight from the factory. I use a basic group of about 10 colors to mix everything I want. To mix paints, you must first understand the basics of color. To begin, all colors are made from what are known as three primary colors: red, blue, and yellow. By mixing your primary colors together, you can create what are known as secondary colors: purple, orange, and green. Red and blue make purple. Red and yellow make orange. And yellow and blue will make green. By changing the ratios of the color or colors mixed together, you can change the color's shade. With your 6 basic colors, 3 primary and 3 secondary, each are grouped into complementary colors. Blue and orange are complementary, red and green are complementary, and yellow and purple are complementary. This means that by mixing 2 complementary colors together, you can darken either shade naturally. You can also mix 2 complementary colors together to make a brown. Orange and blue make a burnt umber type of brown. Red and green make a burnt sienna type of brown. And yellow and purple make a raw sienna type of brown. Why would you use a complementary color to darken another color instead of black? Well, by adding purple to yellow, you will get a more natural darker yellow. If you add black to yellow, you will get an olive or grayish yellow color. It's not that you shouldn't use black, but using a color as complementary might be a better option. To lighten any color, you can just add white. All this may seem a bit confusing at first, but with a little practice, you'll achieve a better control of your colors. To review color mixing, your primary colors are red, blue, and yellow. Your secondary colors are purple, orange, and green. By controlling the ratio of two complementary colors mixed together, you can change their shade naturally. I want to start out with probably one of the most useful techniques for model painting, dry brushing. Dry brushing is where you take a very small amount of paint on a virtually dry brush, hence the name. The first step in dry brushing is to paint the part with a base coat color. A base coat should be the darkest shade of a color you're going to use for the particular area. I paint a thin coat of dark blue over Barnabas Collins' coat. For dry brushing, you want to work from dark to light. Dry brushing works best with a short bristled brush. I prefer using an old brush of mine that has almost become a powder puff. Mixing a lighter shade of blue, I dip my brush into the paint and then wipe the majority of the color back off the brush, leaving it almost dry. Stroke the color gently over the textures of the surface. The raised areas pick up the lighter paint while the lower areas remain darker, creating shadows. Dry brushing is the ideal technique for hair, such as on the Lionel kit from Barker Brothers. It is basically the same technique no matter what the subject matter. Darker base coat of brown with highlighted shades of brown dry brushed over the surface. Take care where you place your highlights. Follow along the highest raised areas for the lightest colors. With dry brushing, base coat with the darkest shade of color. Wipe the majority of the paint off your brush and work from dark to light for best effect. Washes of thin, watery coats of paint that are used for tinting your model kits. It's kind of like painting with watercolor or stains. Washes are like a color glaze that is made by using a little paint thinned with water and airbrush thinner. You can also use a touch of soap and a wash to help it flow into the kit and avoid bleeding up on the surface. Test your wash on a piece of newspaper to see if it's thin enough. If you can read through it, it's probably about right. Using washes, you can generally work from light to dark. On Lionel's wooden stage, I begin by brushing a light brown wash over the surface. The wash runs into the details, becoming darker where it dries in the creases and crevices. I use a blow dryer to speed up the drying time. By adding darker shades of different colors, you can build up your washes to obtain the effect you want. I like to combine washes with dry brushed areas such as hair. Washes help to bring out deeper shadows or soften previously highlighted areas. For washes, remember, thin the colors with water and airbrush thinner. Work from light to dark for best effect. The most advanced technique for modeling is airbrushing. Why should you use an airbrush? Well, the airbrush gives you the most control over subtle shading variations as well as being indispensable for flesh tones. The airbrush paints your kit without actually touching the surface, which eliminates brush strokes. The question I get asked the most is, how do I get realistic flesh tones? I'm going to demonstrate my technique using the airbrush. Since you're painting skin, you want a smooth, flawless finish, and the airbrush is the ideal tool to accomplish this. You can also create special effects with an airbrush, such as see-through clothing and stockings. I'm going to attempt to demonstrate a see-through black lace effect with Atomic Creations' Linnea Quigley kit. To begin, we must first do the flesh tones. I mix my flesh tone with a recipe of 3 basic colors: raw sienna, a yellow-brown, burnt sienna, a red-brown, and white. By combining these 3 basic colors, I can obtain almost any shade of Caucasian flesh. If the color is too yellow, I add more burnt sienna. If it's too red, I add more raw sienna. To lighten, I add white. If I want an African American skin tone, I add burnt umber to the mix. If I want an Asian skin tone, I use more raw sienna. I always mix up a larger quantity of color than I will initially need to give myself enough to lighten for other shades. I call this the master color. Keeping extra amounts of this color can come in handy down the road for touch-ups as you need them. When thinning the paint, I mix a combination of water and airbrush thinner in about a 60% liquid to 40% paint ratio. It may have to vary depending on what brand of paint you use. Stir to make sure you're combining the paint and thinner to avoid particles that may clog your airbrush. You want your paint to be about the consistency of milk. With airbrushing, I work from dark to light. On Linnea, I spray the darkest flesh color for a base coat. I use several light coats instead of one heavy coat. Make sure you take your time and spray into all the areas underneath as well as on top. The paint is so thin that I have to spray several coats to get an even coverage. Next, I take some of my master color and I mix it with a little white and raw sienna for a lighter shade. With light hitting a figure, the tops of the shoulders would be lighter than underneath the arms. Think of your airbrush as a light source and spray lighter shades on the upper areas of the figure. Highlight the tops of the shoulders, the tops of the breast, down the face, and along the jawline. Since I want to try a see-through effect, I paint her top as though it were skin. I make a warm blush shade by mixing red oxide, a rust red, with my medium flesh tone and lightly spray the cheek area. Around the eyes and the breastbone area, just a faint touch of color on the shoulders like she's been in the sun. I'll follow this with my lightest shade of flesh and highlight and soften the colors. To achieve the see-through look, I will have to mask off the skin from the rest of the kit to protect it from overspray. What is the best way to mask off a three-dimensional figure? You can use modeler's masking tape, but that's not very effective in an uneven or textured area. The best material is a liquid mask. There are many liquid masking materials on the market for the artist or modeler. I found the best thing to use is latex mold building compound, available at art or hobby supply stores. It is stronger and less resistant to tearing than the regular liquid frisket. It also pulls off the figure a lot easier and doesn't tend to get stuck in small details or hair. You have to be careful not to leave it on for an extended period of time, like a couple of days, and don't spray enamels or lacquers as they may chemically react with the latex. I always seal the surface I'm masking with a couple of coats of flat lacquer to protect it before I apply the mask. When the masking material is clear, it is fully dry. To achieve the look of see-through fabric, I use a mixture of medium flesh with a touch of black to achieve a grayish flesh color. I spray along the edge of the bodice and shade down the front underneath the breast and rib cage. You want the shadows to fall where they would naturally. You also want flesh tones to be visible in the raised areas. After my basic shading, I pull the airbrush slightly back and lightly mist the entire area with the gray color. When the paint is dried, I gently peel off the masking material, taking care while doing this to make sure I don't scratch or damage the area underneath. As you can see, the latex mold material is very strong and elastic. This keeps the mask from accidentally tearing while you're painting. Here's an example of where the mask didn't fully cover the figure and paint got onto the surface. Since I sealed the kit with flat lacquer when I began, I can easily wipe away the mistake with a small touch of airbrush thinner with a gentle rubbing motion. This saves you from having to touch up a lot of spots. Once you've achieved the effects you want on skin tones, it's time to detail the features of the kit. Blonde hair is the hardest to achieve with paint. I base coat the hair with a mixture of burnt and raw sienna. I then dry brush highlights over the surface texture with lighter shades of yellow-brown raw sienna mixed with white. Lightly fan the brush across the details. Let your color slowly build. Don't rush and get too much paint on the surface. By slowly lightening the color, step after step, you develop natural highlights. Follow the flow of the hair and lighten raised areas more than the ones underneath. Now comes the most important part of your kit, the face. To paint eyes, I mix a warm oyster gray using white, black, and raw sienna. Using a 0 or 00 brush, I fill in the eye area with a warm gray base coat. I then take a red shade made from red oxide, which is a rust red mixed with a little white, and line the lower rim and corner of the eye. The next step is to outline the eye with black. On female characters, you're going for a cosmetic effect, so you want to exaggerate the outline to resemble makeup. On male characters, you want to be more subtle with a dark outline. You can even use a dark brown instead of black. Keep the paint thin enough so that it flows from your brush. Take your time, and if you get out of line, just touch it up with a warm gray or flesh tone. Next, to paint the shape of the iris with black. Make sure the direction of the irises line up or your character will look cross-eyed. After it is dried, I paint the iris with a medium blue, leaving only the thinnest edge of black showing from the base coat. I then highlight the blue to one side of the iris with a lighter shade of blue. Finally, add a black pupil to the center of the eye. I line the crease of the mouth with dark brown. Then I base coat the lips with their darkest shade of color. On Linnea, I'm using more of a coral color instead of red. After they're dry, I highlight the lips with a lighter version of the same color. Then using a slightly lighter shade again, I highlight the center of the lips. This gives them a more three-dimensional effect. To finish our see-through lace effect, I outline the bodice with black. With a steady hand, I use a thin mixture of black and begin to draw the floral lace pattern. It's a slow and tedious process, but the payoff is very rewarding. The final touch is gloss coating the eyes and lips. Pumpkinhead is the kind of kit that would require all the types of techniques discussed so far. Taking my airbrush, I apply a grayish flesh color for my base coat. I then highlight the raised areas with a lighter natural flesh tone. For a more unusual effect, I mix blue into my flesh tone and spray the recessed areas of the temple, neck, down the tail, around the eye sockets, rib cage, basically all the shadowed areas. After I've shadowed and highlighted the skin, I seal it with a couple of coats of flat lacquer. I return with a dark brown wash and apply it to the figure. This brings out all the surface details and textures of the skin. The wash will run off the higher areas and flow into the deeper ones. When the wash evaporates, it will dry lighter than it looks initially. You can also add subtle colors with spot washes. I add a reddish tone into some of the details around the kit. Finally, I come back with a lighter yellow flesh and dry brush raised areas to bring out the extra details and highlights. By working back and forth between dry brushing and washes, you can achieve very dramatic effects. When airbrushing, remember, thin your paint with a mixture of water and airbrush thinner in about a 60% paint to 40% thinner ratio. For best results, work from dark to light for a more natural effect. Use about 30 to 45 pounds of air pressure. Well, that's about it. I hope this tape has given you some useful information that will enable you to gain more pleasure out of modeling. Painting is a never-ending learning process, and that's what makes this hobby so exciting. So have fun, and I hope to see you again soon. And now I'd like to leave you with a brief look at some of my favorite kits from my private collection.